Welcome to this YSL Excel VBA tutorial. This video talks about the basics of formatting shapes in VBA. So it's a direct follow-on from the previous video where we talked about how to create and draw shapes. We'll begin this one with a quick recap of those basic techniques before we start talking about the basics of formatting with how to change the fill colours of shapes. We'll look at several ways to choose colours, including using RGB colours, theme colours and scheme colours, and explain the differences between those techniques and the advantages and disadvantages of each. Continuing the theme of colours, we'll have a quick look at using tints and shades to darken and lighten the same colour that you've used. We'll also look at how to apply pattern and colour gradient effects to the fill effects of shapes. We'll move on then and look at the basics of formatting lines before we look at some of the slightly fancier, slightly more esoteric techniques like glow effects, reflections, shadows and soft edges. Towards the end of the video we'll have a very brief look at some basic 3D effects before we wrap up with a quick look at how you can copy formats between shapes and then set default formats for shapes for the entire workbook. So lots to do here, let's get started. Okay, well to get started all I've done so far is created a brand new blank Excel workbook and I've saved it as a macro enabled workbook called Formatting Shapes. From here I'm going to head straight into the Developer tab and then the Visual Basic Editor, and then from there I'm going to insert a new module, and our first job is to create a couple of simple subroutines that we're going to use a few times throughout the course of the video. The first one's going to delete all the shapes that sit on sheet 1, and then the second one's going to create a brand new simple rectangle shape. So the first subroutine we'll create will be called something like delete sheet 1 shapes. And then we saw how to do this in the previous video, but just as a very quick reminder, one technique you can use, fairly traditional way you can apply the same technique to every object in a collection, is to write a for each loop. So you begin by declaring a variable, so in this case it will be dim s as shape, and then to process every item in the collection of shapes on sheet 1, we can say for each s in sheet1.shapes. I'll close the loop by saying next s, and then inside the loop I can apply the delete method to every single shape by saying s.delete. So that works quite neatly. We saw that technique in the previous video. There is a slightly quicker way to do this with shapes, however. If I just select that code and comment it out just for the time being by hitting the comment button on the toolbar. If you haven't got this toolbar displayed, you can just right click somewhere near the top of the screen and choose to view the edit toolbar, and that will just edit out a block of selected code. What we can then do is say sheet1.shapes.select. Rather than just select, in fact, select all, which, as the name suggests, selects all the shapes on sheet 1. The neat thing about that is that regardless of how many there are, I can apply the delete method just to the selection object. So if I say selection.delete, because I've selected all the shapes, of course, that will delete all the shapes on sheet 1. So that can work slightly quicker than looping through every single shape and deleting them individually. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this video which technique you choose to use, but that's a quick simple way to get started, a subroutine that deletes all the shapes on sheet 1. Okay, next I'd like to create another subroutine that just generates a brand new simple rectangle shape. So let's create a new sub called draw one rectangle, or something along similar lines. It's fairly descriptive, and I'll spell rectangle properly as well. And then all I'm going to do in here is say sheet1.shapes.addShape. Just as we saw in the previous video, this simple code that allows you to create new shape objects. With the basic add shape technique, we have to first of all choose what type of object we're creating. So in this case I'm going to say MSO shape rectangle. Then we need to decide on its position and its dimensions. So first of all, its position is controlled with left, so it's the distance in points from the left of the worksheet to the left of the shape. So let's set that to something small like 20, and likewise the top, let's set that to something like 20 as well, so that's the distance from the top of the sheet to the top of the shape. Width and height, fairly obviously, again in points, so I'm going to give it a width of 200 and a height of 100, and that simple routine will draw one rectangle, as the name suggests. Just to very quickly test that these two work, I'm just going to restore down the VB editor window and arrange the screen so that I can see the top left hand corner of sheet 1, and if I were to run my draw one rectangle routine once, just to make sure that it creates one, and then run my delete sheet 1 shapes routine just to make sure that everything gets deleted, that looks pretty good to me. So those two techniques work. Now we can get on with the process of formatting shapes. Let's start the section on formatting with a very quick look at the basics of changing the fill colour. I guess that's the most obvious change you can make to a shape in terms of formatting. So let's begin a new subroutine that's going to be called something like change fill colour, and then let's make a call to each of the two routines we've created so far. I'm going to call delete sheet 1 shapes, and then I'm also going to call draw 1 rectangle, so we have one object on the sheet that we know we can format. I'm also going to declare a variable that's going to help me to reference the shape that exists on sheet 1. So knowing that it's the only shape that exists when I run this subroutine, or assuming that that's the case, what I'm going to do is declare a variable called dim_s as shape, and then I can reference that object once I've drawn it by saying set s equals sheet1 dot shapes, and then refer to the first item in the collection, so shapes 1. That just gives me a slightly easier time in terms of referencing the shape and modifying its properties. Just to tidy up a little bit as well, I'm going to delete this commented code up at the top just to give myself a little more space, and then hopefully that will make life a little easier and a little easier to show you the code. Okay, so from this point all I need to do is modify the appropriate property of the shape to change its fill colour. So if I start by referencing the shape with my variable s, then I can look for the fill property and then enter another full stop to see the IntelliSense with the list of various colour properties. Now you'll see there are two properties that refer to colour. There's back colour and fore colour. Now in most Microsoft products you tend to change the back colour to change the fill colour of an object. But when it comes to shapes on sheets like this in Excel, it's actually the fore colour that we want to change. We'll talk about what the back colour is for a little bit later on, but for now we're going to stick with the fore colour. So I'm going to go for fore colour, then enter another full stop to see yet more properties. And there are three different properties in this list that will let me modify the fill colour. I'm going to stick with one called RGB just for the time being. The two other ones we're going to encounter later on are Object Theme Colour and Scheme Colour. We'll mention those fairly briefly. But RGB is almost certainly the one you're going to go with in the real world, simply because it's the most reliable and it's got the widest range of possible values. So technically speaking, the RGB value is just a number, a whole number between a value of 0 and 16,777,215. I'll put that in a little comment in a moment. So basically you can pick any number between that upper and lower limit and you'll get some sort of colour. So make it equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And let me just add a quick comment at the end of this. That can be anything between 0 to 16,777,215. So, having just done that, if I were to run that subroutine either by pressing F5 or clicking the green triangle button, I'll see that I get a fairly horrible, hideous shade of murky green. That wasn't a particularly good colour to choose. Let's try something slightly different. So let's just modify the colour number and then run that one again. That's not much less hideous, but at least it's an obviously different colour. Okay, so there's one way to approach changing colours using the RGB property and modifying that to a number between 0 and 16.7 million. Now, although using a simple number provides you with a lot of choice of what colour you use, as I say, 16.7 million different values for this particular property, it's not the most convenient thing to remember. So there are a few more convenient ways to refer to a particular colour that you might want to use. So rather than using the number as we have here, what I'm going to do is copy and paste part of this line, and then I can comment out the existing one, just to keep it in there for reference. And then instead of using a number, we can refer to one of the very basic Visual Basic colour constants. There are 8 of these, and they all begin with the letters VB. So for instance, if I wanted it to be red, I could search for VB red. If I press Ctrl and space to display the IntelliSense, I'll find VB red in the list there. And if I enter that and then run the subroutine by hitting the F5 key, you'll see of course that the new shape becomes red. Not a particular surprise. Now, there are 8 of these. There's red, blue, green, yellow, white, black, cyan and magenta, but if you can't remember those, then what you could do instead is remember just the name of the enumeration, or in fact technically it's a class that contains these colour constants. So there's a class there called colour constants, and if you enter a full stop after that, that will give you a list of all 8, essentially the Visual Basic primary colours. So you can choose any of those in the list, and then once you've done that, you can hit F5 to execute it, and it will use that specific colour. Now, although the colour constant names are much easier to remember than a specific number, of course, you've only got 8 of them, which is somewhat limiting when you realise there's 16.7 million different colours you could use or set via the RGB property. So there is a slightly wider range of named colours you can use as well. There's a set of colours called the RGB colour constants. So in this case I'm going to just comment out that line again and then paste in what I copied previously. And this time what I'm going to do is use the IntelliSense and look for a list of named colours that all begin with the letters RGB. Now again, if you type in the letters RGB, that will take you straight to the list where all these sit, and every single one of these colours begins with the letters RGB. If you wanted to refer to the enumeration first, like we did with colour constants, then the name of the enumeration in this case is XL RGB colour, followed by a full stop, and then you'll see just that short list of colours. So again, you can scroll through this list and find the name of a colour you particularly like. There's an enormous number of these. I think my favourite one is RGB Papaya Whip. It's not my favourite colour, it's just the nicest one to say. But feel free to choose any one. They've all got some wonderfully flowery names. Misty Rose, for instance. Let's go with that one. I've not used that one before. So if I were to run the subroutine this time, again, you'll get a different colour yet again. Now, although there are significantly more than just 8 RGB colours, there are significantly short of 16.7 million of them. So how do you get access to all of the other colours rather than just remembering the specific number for the colour you want? Well, one neat way to do this is by using a function called RGB, which accepts a list of 3 different values and calculates the correct colour number based on an amount of red and green and blue, hence the name RGB. My favourite little demonstration for this that I do on training courses is for the NHS colours, which are fairly easy to find with a really quick Google search. So if I just have a quick look at for NHS Blue, for instance, or NHS brand guidelines or identity guidelines, that link will pop up fairly close to the top. And if I click through into that page, it'll give me a list of all the acceptable NHS colours. So the idea behind the NHS colours, and like any brand guidelines, any corporate identity, is that the colours you use are a specific definition of colours. So it's not just any old random blue. This core NHS blue here is set via an RGB value of 0, red, 94, green and 184 blue. So it's a particular mix of those 3 colours that generates this specific NHS blue. And the NHS has a variety of different levels of these colours, so there's dark blue and light and bright blue with different RGB values, and so on and so on and so on. Now, if you're working for a particular organisation, you may already have these particular brand guidelines defined for your organisation. So let's just say that I wanted to reproduce NHS blue for my rectangular shape in my Excel workbook. So that would be an RGB of 0, 94 and 184. So to make that work, what I could do is head back into the Visual Basic editor, and then again I'm just going to paste in what I copied earlier on and comment out the previous line, and then I'm going to make this RGB value equal to the result of the RGB function. So if I say RGB and then open up a set of parentheses, I can specify the amount of red and green and blue. Now each of these 3 parameters accepts a number between 0 and 255. So there's 256 to the power 3 colours, which is exactly the same as the number of values for the RGB property. So it was 0, 94, 184 for NHS blue. If I close the parentheses at that point and then make sure I can see my shape and then run the subroutine again, I'll see a new rectangular shape with NHS blue fill colour. Now, unless you've got a handy list of all your RGB definitions, remembering a whole new list of RGB values isn't that much more convenient than remembering just the raw underlying values. So one neat trick to get around this is to create your own enumeration or your own list of constants. So similar to those that we have for the XL RGB colours, we've got flowery names like RGB Misty Rose. That's just a convenient name that actually stores a number behind the scenes. If you want to find out what those numbers are, a simple way to find out would be to use the Immediate window. So if I headed up to the View menu at the top of the screen and choose Immediate window, I can ask questions in here. So for instance, if I typed in a question mark and then looked for RGB, I'll spell RGB properly, RGB Misty Rose, and then simply hit Enter, then the value that's returned is the underlying RGB number that I could simply paste in directly rather than using RGB Misty Rose. So just to prove that, I'm going to copy that number to the clipboard and then replace the number that I typed in myself earlier on. Just change the lines that are active, so comment out one line and uncomment that one, and if I were to run that subroutine at this point, I'll get an RGB Misty Rose coloured rectangle. So the trick to this then is creating your own constants that contain those values. So let me just find out what the actual underlying number for NHS Blue is. If I copy this bit of code here, RGB 0, 94, 184, and then I can paste that into the Immediate window just after the question mark, and then hit Enter, and the actual number for NHS Blue is that number there. I'm not going to pronounce it. So one simple way to do that, if all I wanted was NHS Blue, and I didn't care about all of the other colours, a simple thing to do would be to declare a single constant that contains that number. So a quick simple way to do that would be at the top of this module. I could declare a new constant, so I can say const NHS Blue, and the data type of this will be a long, so a long integer, and then I have to make this equal to the number that's just in the immediate window here. So let me just copy that number, and then I've now got a new constant that stores the value of NHS blue. So what I could do further on down in my procedure is, let me create another s.fill.forecolor.rgb equals, and then press Control and space, and I'll have access to NHS blue as a constant. But if I were to run this subroutine at this point, I'll get a single rectangle coloured in NHS blue. Now the trick to this is really creating an enumeration that contains all of the possible colours you might want. So let's have a quick go at doing that now. Let's create an enumeration that contains a few of these NHS colours. So what I'm going to do first is remove the reference const from the start of that line, and what I'm going to do instead is above that line I'm going to create a new enumeration. So I'm going to create a public enum, and I'm going to call this one NHS Colours, and yes, I'm afraid I'm spelling it the British English way rather than the American English way. Apologies for that if you're watching in the States. What I'll then do is give myself a couple of blank lines and say end enum, and then I don't need to define the data type for NHS blue. All the values in an enumeration are long integers, so I can just remove the as long part and then simply say NHS blue equals that particular number. Now the great thing about that is that I've got a single constant in that enumeration, but I can add as many more as I like and assign my own specific values to each one. So let's just really quickly pick a couple of other simple ones from the same page that I looked at earlier on. I guess we might as well pick NHS dark blue, so that's 048135, so let's just copy those values, and then I can call this one NHS dark blue, and now I can make that one equal to, well, first of all I need to know what the actual values are. So let me paste those values that I've just copied into the immediate window and change the slashes to commas, and then hit enter at the end of that line, and that gives me the number for NHS dark blue. So I can copy and paste that. And then let's just do one more quick simple one just to demonstrate the principle, so we've got something a little bit more interesting. Let's pick a completely different colour. NHS pink, let's go with NHS pink. And you don't tend to see that one used very often. Anyway, NHS pink, let's go back to the VB editor again, and I'll paste those values into the RGB function in the immediate window, and then hit enter. Excuse me, change the forward slashes to commas first of all. Silly schoolboy error, beg your pardon. And there we go, there's the value for NHS pink. I will copy that to the clipboard. I will call this constant NHS pink, and then make that equal to the value I've just entered. I'm just going to close the immediate window at this point just so I can see more clearly on screen what I'm doing. And again, what I can do here is I can either refer to the NHS colours directly by looking for the individual NHS named colours, or I can refer to my enumeration NHS colours, enter a full stop, and then just pick one from a simple short list like so. If I can just make sure I can see the Excel worksheet in the background and then run this subroutine one more time, there we go, an NHS pink coloured rectangle. Okay, so those are the various techniques you can use to set the RGB colour for a shape. But there are two other colour properties you can use for various aspects of a shape. Let's have a quick look at something called the theme colour, or the object theme colour next. Theme colours you may have encountered before just through using Excel or even any of the other Office products. Themes or document themes are designed as a sort of collection of different colours and font styles and shape styles that you can apply quickly using a single click. So for instance, if I were to select this shape and then just head back to the regular Home tab in the ribbon, if I looked at the drop down list for fill colours here, what I'm seeing is a list of theme colours. You'll see it's listed as theme colours. So let me just choose, I'm going to choose one here, this sort of, this bright blue colour, blue accent 1. Now the idea behind a theme colour is it's just one of a collection of colours that can be modified by changing a property on the page layout tab in the ribbon. If I head to the page layout page, then there's a section there called themes. There's also a separate one just for colours. So themes contain stuff like not just colours but also fonts and other formatting effects. Colours is purely just for colours. So for instance, if I clicked on the colours drop down list, there's a list of different colour settings I can choose, and you should be able to make out in the background there actually, using this live preview feature, as I hover the mouse over different items, it changes the colour to match the accent 1 colour for the particular colour theme. The same should be true for the full themes as well. You might not be able to see this in the background. Let me just, you can just about make it out in the background there. Let me just move the shape so you can see it a little more clearly. So for the themes, if I hover over the different themes, you'll see the colour changes as well. So, theme colours are a reasonably good idea. It allows you to quickly change the visual appearance of an entire document using a simple click, but as long as you use the theme colours in the first place. So there could be also a danger of that, of course. If you choose a theme colour using the fill colour tool, thinking that it won't ever change, then you may run the risk of finding that that colour has changed if somebody applies a different theme. So use theme colours with caution, but just to very quickly show you how they work in VBA terms. Let's switch back to the VBA editor, and I'm just going to add a couple of extra quick lines. There's no real reason to create another new subroutine for this, so let me just comment out the last line we wrote. I'm going to give myself a bit more space so you can see this a little more clearly. A few blank lines right at the bottom there. And then I'll just add a quick comment using theme colours. And then let's say something quick and simple like s.fill.forecolor.object theme color. And I can make this equal to, and the cool thing about this is that I don't have to choose a specific number. It's got a list of actual named colours from this list. So you saw earlier on when I used the drop down list, I chose accent 1 for the background colour. So the accent 1 colour is this one. If you hover the mouse over each of the colours in the list, it will show you what particular named colour it is. That's accent 2, that's accent 3. Then I've got the standard background 1, text 1. Then that should be background 2, and so on and so on. So you can see which colour corresponds to which name by hovering the mouse over the colours in the grid. Let me just quickly choose a simple one. Let's go with accent 3, just for something slightly different. And then if I were to run that subroutine, I'll end up with a new shape, not a particularly exciting colour, admittedly. But if I did go back to the page layout page and looked at either the colours or the themes, you'll see the colour of the shape I've just selected is changing. So that's the basics of using themes and theme colours. Now, as well as being able to apply a theme colour to the forecolor of a shape, you can also change the overall theme, or indeed the set of colours used for the document, using code as well. The key to this is knowing where the files are stored that contain the theme colours. So depending on which version of Office you're using, the file path might be slightly different for you. But for me, on my particular machine, using Excel 2016 at this point, if I open a Windows Explorer window by holding down the Windows key and pressing E, then browse to the root of my C drive and then look for Program Files x86. And then in there, what I want to do is look for the Microsoft Office folder. So if I scroll down far enough, I'll find Microsoft Office. And if I double click into there should be a different folder for each different version of Office that you've got installed, or at least have had installed previously. But we can ignore all of these individual Office installations and just head straight to the root folder. So if I double click on the root folder there should be in there a directory called Document Themes, and that will correspond to the version of Office that you're currently using. So Office 16 is the same as Office 2016. The numbers don't necessarily match up, however. So Office 15 was for Office 2013, Office 14 was for Office 2010, and so on and so on. So Document Themes 16, and there's the list of all my individual theme colours. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to apply the Ion theme. I picked that one because it's got the shortest name, obviously. What I would need to do is I'd need to know the folder path and the file name. So I'm just going to copy the directory path from the title bar, or the address bar of the window. So just click into there and press Ctrl+C to copy. And then if I head back to the Visual Basic Editor, I can say something like this workbook dot apply theme. And then what I would then need to do is pass in the full file name and folder path for the theme that I want to apply. So that's passed in as a string. So inside a set of double quotes, if I just paste in the path I've just copied, let me put this onto a separate line as well so you can see it a little more clearly without me having to scroll left and right on the screen. Then I can type in a backslash and say ion.thmx. So having done that, if I were to execute that subroutine, and I'll end up with the same shape that I've just created using an accent 3 colour, but this time rather than that boring old grey, I've got this fairly murky, hideous, yellowy, browny colour instead. That's the Ion Themes accent 3 colour. So we should be able to see, if I go back to the home page and look at the fill colour tool, that's the same as theme 3, or beg pardon, accent 3 in the Ion theme. Now, should I want to switch this back to the original theme, I could either do that manually back on the page layout page and choose the Office theme, or of course there is obviously an option for that as well in the folder, so the Office theme file thmx. So I could do that in code as well. So let's change this so it goes back to the Office theme instead. So I can say Office theme It's not case sensitive, but it is good practice to match case. So there we go. So if I were to run that one again at that point, I'll end up with the same boring old grey shape that I had earlier on. Now, one of the features of applying a theme is that it doesn't just change the colours of the document, it also changes things like fonts and other formatting effects. If it was just the colours that you were interested in changing, rather than applying an entire theme, what you could do is modify the theme colour scheme. So let me just comment out the two lines that I've used there, although it doesn't really matter because it would just apply the same theme anyway. What I could do instead of applying an entire theme is I could just change the theme colour. Now to do that you need to know the folder path and the file name of a theme colour file. So from the same root folder, document theme 16, there's a separate theme colours folder. And inside there is just a bunch of XML files containing definitions for individual colours. So let's choose again the shortest named one, the one called red. I'll go with red.xml. To apply it, the code is ever so slightly different. You begin with a reference to this workbook again, so let's say this workbook, followed by a full stop, and then you can say theme dot theme color scheme, and then you can say apply the load method to that. So the load method has a single required parameter, which is the file name. So if I enter a space underscore, so I can continue this on the next line, open and close a set of double quotes, and then switch back to the Windows Explorer window, and then copy the path to this folder. And then switch back to the VBA editor and paste that path in, and then type in a backslash and then red.xml. So same idea again. If I were to run this subroutine at this point, I'll end up with that same hideous murky yellowy brown colour, sadly. But you can see hopefully here on the theme colours button tool on the page layout tab, I've got the red theme applied. Oh yeah, indeed, there's that horrible murky green yellowy brown colour. I should have picked something like red violet, that would have been more interesting. Anyway, hopefully that's enough to give you the idea. Now, one small problem I've got with this theme colour is I don't know where the file is stored that holds the original Office themes. If I have a quick look in the theme colours folder, although I've got a reference to Office 2007 to 2010, I don't know where the actual one just called Office is. To be fair, I haven't really looked for it that hard because I'd be very unlikely to do this personally in the real world. So what I'm going to do just to cheat is switch the theme colours back to Office manual. I'm just going to click on the Office theme back in the colours tool on the ribbon and making sure I've got the Office overall theme applied there as well, although I've already written code to do that. So there you go, there's the basic principles of using themes and theme colours. Okay, just to look at one final property that you can use to modify the colours of shapes. I'm just going to comment out some of the lines of code in this subroutine again. So I'm going to comment out the line that changes it to an object theme colour, and then comment out the lines that modify the theme colour scheme. The very last property that we can use, if I just refer to my S variable again, then the fill property, then the for colour property, and then finally in there, the option called scheme colour. Now scheme colours are a little bit old-fashioned. You'll hopefully recognise this. If you've ever used a version of Excel from Excel 2003 or earlier, you're probably going to recognise the colours we're allowed to use here. So the idea behind a scheme colour is it's just like the RGB colour, it's just a number again, but it's a much shorter range of colours, a much smaller range. It's only a colour between 0 and 80 in this case. So I say scheme colour equals, I don't know, let's say 37 just for the sake of argument, and then I were to run that subroutine at this point, that's scheme colour 37 as it turns out. You'll see if I change it again, I run the subroutine again, I'll get a completely different colour. If I enter a value up to 80, then that's acceptable. If I try to extend past that value, I'll get a runtime error, so the specified value is outside of the range. So, it's a very limited set of values, of course, only 81 different values, 0 to 80, so much more restrictive than the RGB values. The idea behind the scheme colours is they're related to the older versions of Microsoft Excel, so Excel 2003 and earlier could only use a very limited palette of colours. The palette could be different for each different workbook, but if you wanted to see what those colours are and where they're stored, have a quick look in the File menu of Excel and then through the Options list. If you then go to the Save page of the Excel Options dialog box, there's a little button on there somewhere called Colours, and if you click onto that button, you'll see a list of colours. Now it doesn't show the full list of scheme colours, although some of them are duplicated, as you'll see in a moment. We're going to produce a routine that lists out all the scheme colours for the particular workbook. The idea would be, let me just very quickly see, I can't quite demonstrate this just yet. If I were to run this subroutine again, if I just cancel out of this dialog box and hit OK, and then I were to run this subroutine again, and let's change that back to something like 42, for example. If I were to run this one at this point, so that's picked that kind of fairly horrible minty green colour. If I switch back to Excel, chose File, Options, and then went to the Save page and chose Colours again, if I could identify where that minty green colour was there, like there it is, so I could select that colour and then choose to modify it. So let's modify it to something obviously different, like this bright pink colour, and hit OK, and then OK again, and OK one more time. And if I were to run the subroutine again at this point, to change the colour to colour number 42, it's now a completely different colour. So basically, to get around the fact that earlier versions of Excel only had a very limited set of colours for each workbook, they gave you the option to modify the limited set of colours for each file. So not quite as powerful as the RGB values, but still potentially useful to know. So here's what we're going to do with this particular workbook. We're going to run a subroutine that loops through all 81 of our scheme colours and produces a different shape for each one. So let's create a new subroutine just down below that's going to be called something like List Scheme Colours. I'm going to begin this one by declaring a whole bunch of different variables. So let's do something quick and simple. Let's declare an S variable, a shape variable first of all, so dim S as shape. And then I want to declare a variable that's going to allow me to loop a set number of times. So it's essentially a loop counter variable. So I'm going to say dim I as integer. We're going to use a for next loop to do this. I'm also going to keep track of the positions of the shapes. We're going to end up with 81 different shapes added in the same subroutine this time, and I don't want them all to sit on top of each other. So I'd like to calculate the positions of my shapes as I add them in. So I'm going to say dim x as integer, comma y as integer, and that's going to allow me to keep track of the x and y positions, so the left and top positions effectively. I'll call them x and y just for convenience. I'd also like to keep track of the width and height of the shapes, just in case I wanted to modify those later on. So I'm going to have a couple of variables, dim s width as integer, and then also s height as integer. S height as integer. There we go. One last one, I want to keep a variable that stores how many columns of shapes I'm going to create. So what I want to do basically is create a sort of a grid effect, similar to the one that I just showed you on the options dialog box to list out all the different colours. I'd like to keep track of how many columns I'd like to create. So I'm going to say dim s cols also as integer. Once I've done that, I'd like to make sure that I've deleted any existing shapes on the worksheet, and that's going to be more important again. If I were to run this one again, I want to remove all 81 shapes. So let's make a quick call to delete sheet 1 shapes. Then I'm going to set a couple of default values. So I'm going to say s width equals 20 and s height equals 20. So I'm going to set those to the same value. We'll end up with a grid of square shapes to begin with. So s width and s height equals 20. And then I want to start with 8 columns of boxes. So I'm going to say s cols equals 8. Now I can start looping the 81 times I need to loop to produce a different box for each scheme colour. So I'm going to use a for next loop to do that. I'm going to say for I equals 0 to 80. That's the range of scheme colours I'm allowed to use. And so that I don't forget later on, I'll give myself a couple of blank lines and say next I. The first thing I'd like to do in for each iteration of the loop is to calculate the left and top position. So I'm using x as the left position for the shape and y as the top position for each shape. So I'm going to calculate x by saying x equals, and then I'd like to wrap up in a couple of sets of parentheses, I mod s cols. So what that individual part of the calculation does, the mod operator or modulus operator returns the remainder of dividing one number by another. So what this is going to do is divide the number that I'm currently on in the loop by the number of columns I want to get. So I will be 0 to begin with, so it'll be 0 divided by 8 for the first time through the loop, and then 1 divided by 8, and then 2 divided by 8, etc. And it will give the remainder of dividing that number by that number. What I can then do is multiply that by the width of each shape. So I can say s width. So for instance, the result of the first iteration of this loop, when I is 0, the result of that calculation will be 0. So the left-hand position of each shape, the first time through the loop will be 0, so it will sit at the left-hand edge of the sheet. The next time round, the remainder of dividing 1 by 8 will be 1 multiplied by the s width, which is 20. So the position of the next shape will be 20 along. So that's 20 points from the left, and then the next iteration of the loop will be 2 divided by 8 and give me the remainder, which is 2 multiplied by 20, which will be 40. So essentially you're building up a row of shapes, each one sitting right next to the other. We can use a similar sort of technique to calculate the top position, or it's a slightly different calculation. So what I'm going to do here is say y equals, then I'm going to use the int function to make sure that I return a whole number. So I'm going to say int, and then instead of parentheses, I divided by s cols. And then, if I close the parentheses, I can then multiply that by the s height. So a similar sort of principle, it divides the value of the loop counter by the number of columns I've got and returns just the whole number portion of that, so it won't return any decimal places, and then simply multiplies that by the height of each shape to effectively work out the position of each shape from the top. Okay, so having done that, what I can then do is create a new shape and set the position and dimensions of that appropriately. So I can say set s equals sheet1.shapes, and then say .add shape. And the type of shape I want to add is going to be another MSO shape rectangle. And then the left of the shape will be positioned by X. The top of the shape will be positioned by Y. The width will be S width. And the height will be S height. So if I fill in all those values, the final thing I need to do is change the forecolor of the shape to be equal to, or the scheme colour of the forecolor to be equal to the value of I. So having done that, if I were to say s.fill.forecolor.scheme colour equals I. And that's it. So there's not a lot of code there. As long as you understand the basic maths behind these two calculations, that's basically the core part of the procedure. So if I were to maybe set a breakpoint and then just hit the F5 key just to run up to that point, then what I can do is use the F8 key to begin stepping through. So X and Y to begin with, these should both be set to 0. So X is 0 and Y is 0. So the new shape that gets created will sit at position 0, 0, top left hand corner. And then if I change the fill colour, that'll be equal to scheme colour 0. And then the next iteration of the loop, so this time X will be 20, and then Y will still be 0, and the next shape will sit in next door, and then the next shape will be coloured, I is number 1, so that's scheme colour 1, and so on and so on and so on. So you could carry on using the F8 key to step through, or if you just get bored, you can remove the breakpoint by clicking onto the little brown circle, and then press F5 to run all the way through to the very end, and we'll end up with 81 different shapes, each one coloured in with a different scheme colour. Now I appreciate that was quite a lot of time and effort to show you something that in the real world, in reality, you're fairly unlikely to use, but I couldn't not cover it. I guess if I hadn't covered it, there'd be loads of questions at the bottom of the video saying what on earth is a scheme colour, and I'd have to explain it anyway, so at least now you know that you don't need to use it. Unless I suppose maybe you're still supporting legacy workbooks, in which case you may find that it comes in handy from time to time. I guess the biggest limitation is of course the limited range of colours, and by default lots of them are duplicated as well, and there's quite a lot of effort to change them. So you could use it if you really wanted to, but I don't think that in the real world you will. I think it's far more likely you're going to be using just the RGB colours, maybe theme colours if you want that sort of flexibility to change the overall appearance of your documents. One last quick little thing to look at with the basic fill colours before we move on to some more exciting things like patterns and colour gradients and things. How you change the fill colour of a shape to have no fill whatsoever. So the simplest way to achieve that is just to set the fill property, or the visible property of the fill property, to be false. So very quickly, just a quick subroutine here that says something like clear fill. And then I'm going to say make a reference to, make a call to delete sheet 1 shapes, and then I'll make a call to draw 1 rectangle, and I'll declare a variable that can hold a reference to a shape, so dim s as shape, and I'll say set s equals sheet 1 dot shapes, open some parentheses, and then refer to the number 1 again. So having done that, I can now say s.fill and .visible. Beg pardon, I'll spell visible properly with a V rather than a C, and then make that equal to MSO false, Microsoft Office false. So if I were to set a breakpoint on that line and then hit F5 to run all the way up to that point, and then just use the F8 key to step through just so you can prove that at the moment it does have a fill colour. If I hit F8 to execute that line, you'll see that it now has no fill colour, it's completely transparent. So, something quick and easy to demonstrate, but it's worthwhile knowing how you can clear the fill for a shape.
Now, should I want to turn the fill back on again, that's pretty straightforward. The same fill effects are still in place. So in place, it's still got the same fill color. So before I stop running this subroutine, if I just change this back to MSO true, and then just drag the yellow arrow back up to that previous line, and then just use the F8 key to step through that line again, you'll see that the fill colour becomes visible again, retaining all the same properties that it had last time, so whatever colour you'd originally set. So that's the basics of making the fill invisible and visible again. Okay, the next thing to have a quick look at is changing the brightness or the tint of a colour in your shape. So just to mention the idea of tints or shades, if I select this shape that I've got in the worksheet at this point and head back to the Home tab in the ribbon in Excel, if I look at the Fill Colour tool, you'll notice that each of the main colours in the theme colour has a set of different values representing essentially like a percentage fill of that particular colour. So these are referred to as tints and shades. Now there are properties of a shape that you can modify in code to generate those tints and shades. So switching back to the VB editor, and in fact let's have a quick look back at the NHS website to see where this might come in handy. You'll see this sort of thing is part of many corporate brand guidelines. If I scroll down far enough, there we go. So there's a section here about using tints. So the base colour sitting at the top there, but there are various different shades of basically percentage values of the colours of the base colours. So there are two properties of a shape fill that you can use to modify that. There's a brightness property and there's a tint and shade property, and they both work in fundamentally the same way. So if I switch back to the VB editor again, what I'm going to do is make a copy of the last subroutine that we created, actually the entire thing. Let's copy the whole thing, and if I paste it in down below, I'll just modify the name of the subroutine, so I'm going to call it color tints or something along those lines. Then I can remove the s.fill.visible, and what I'll do instead is I'll say with s.fill.forecolor. I'm going to use a with structure here, so I'm going to say with s.fill.forecolor, and then I'll make sure I add in the end with, and then let's have a quick look at the brightness property first of all. So we need to give this this shape a base color first of all. Let's set its base color to .rgb equals, then I'm going to use my NHS blue colour that I created earlier on. What I'm then going to do is modify its brightness by saying .brightness equals. Now with the brightness property you don't get any help here whatsoever. The brightness property is just a value, just a number, and the number is between -1 and 1. So 0 is the base colour, negative numbers make that colour darker, and positive numbers make that colour brighter. So just to demonstrate the absolute basic principle, if I said something like, let's say brightness equals -1, and then I'm just going to copy that line actually and paste it in a few more times, and I'll change it so it's -0.5, and then I'll make it 0, and then I'll make it positive 0.5, and then finally positive 1. So we'll step through this just so you can quickly see the changes as we go through. Okay, so just setting a quick breakpoint on this line where I'm setting the colour to be NHS blue, making sure I can see the worksheet in the background. If I use F5 to run all the way up to that point and then begin using the F8 key. So that's NHS blue. The brightness set to -1 will make it essentially black, so that's 0 brightness effectively. Then 0.5, so that's a sort of dark shade of NHS blue. And then 0 makes it the original base NHS blue colour. Then 0.5 makes it 50% lighter, and then brightness 1 will be white. So that's the basics of setting the brightness property. You can achieve essentially the same effect using the tint and shade property as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy and paste that set of 5 lines where I was referencing the brightness property, and then just paste those in down below. And then what I'm going to do is comment out the brightness lines there. And then I need to change the word brightness to the word tint and shade. A simple, quick, easy way to achieve that, I think, is to use a find replace. So if I select that set of lines there and press Ctrl H on the keyboard to find replace, I want to look for the word brightness and replace with tint and shade. And if I were to just hit the replace all button there, making sure I've got that set of text selected rather than the entire document. So 5 replacements should be made. Tint and shade equals. Okay, so once again I'm going to run up to the point where I've
just before I set the NHS blue colour, if I hit F5 to run up to that point, and then use F8 to step through from there. So tint and shade -1 will essentially set it to black, and then that's 50% darker, that's the base colour, 50% lighter. Slightly different when you tint a colour rather than changing its brightness. You might notice a slight difference that the tint isn't quite the same as increasing the brightness of the colour. But again, if you put the tint up to a value of 1, then it essentially goes to white again. Now you do also have to be slightly careful with using brightness and tint and shade in the same procedure. So for example, if I were to just uncomment the brightness equals 1 line, and then I were to run this subroutine all the way up to the breakpoint using F5, then use the F8 key to step through from there. If I set the brightness equal to 1, that makes the shape effectively white. So then I change the tint and shade to -1, which makes it black, and then tint and shade 50% darker is essentially 50% darker from white, so I get a sort of pale grey colour rather than a dark blue colour. Then tint and shade 0 is white, because that's the tinted and shaded, or the non-tinted and shaded version of the original NHS blue colour set to a brightness of 1. So likewise, tint and shade 0.5 will make the white 50% brighter, or 50% tinted, and then 1 will make the white super white. I don't know. It doesn't change the base colour basically. So just be slightly careful of using brightnesses and tints and shades. Each can have an effect on the other, of course. So just to make you aware of that. In reality, again, I'm not sure whether you're likely to use that. You can generate all the colours you need using simple RGB values. So each of these colours that we were setting there with tints and shades were just more values in the range of RGB colours. And if you can establish what those specific numbers are, you could then just simply add those to an enumeration. Then you've got quick, simple access to them rather than having to worry about whether you've got the correct shade each time. So let me just remove the breakpoint from that one, and then we'll move on to something slightly different. Now so far all we've done is change the forecolour of each shape that we've created, but you may have noticed much earlier on that there was also a back colour property as well. Currently, if we were to change the back colour property, it would have no effect whatsoever on the shapes we're creating, and just to very quickly prove that, let's just head back up, and I'm going to make a copy of my clear fill subroutine. I'm going to select the entire subroutine and copy that, and then paste it in down towards the bottom of the module. Let's just change the name of the subroutine so that it says something like change back colour, and then let's just change the s.fill dot, and then we can say back colour dot, and you've again got RGB, object theme colour and scheme colour, so the same 3 properties for modifying the colour. Again, I'm going to go for RGB, and I'm going to try to make the RGB equal to, let's say make it something obvious, RGB hot pink. That'll be nice and obviously different to the original colours we're using. So having done that, if I were to run the subroutine, I'll end up with a shape whose background colour hasn't changed. It retains the default colour for the shape for this particular document theme. The idea behind a back colour is it only has an effect on shapes which display more than one colour, and usually you do that using some kind of pattern fill. So before we can modify the back colour, we need to change the pattern of the shape. Now there's a couple of different ways you can do that, but quickly and simply what we're going to do here, let's create a width block again. I'm going to say width s.fill, and then I'm going to say .backColor.rgb equals RGB hot pink on a separate line. I'm going to stick in an end width. I'm going to set a forecolour as well. I was going to say .foreColor. Let's make it very obviously different. .foreColor.rgb equals, let's go for RGB lime green. That'll look beautiful together. And then before I do all that, I'm going to change the pattern that's used on the shape. So I can say .patterned, and then I can pass in a value to the patterned method. So there's a list of MSO pattern types we can use. So some of these are just different sort of percentage fills, so they're sort of dot shaded to try to sort of shade in the different shapes. I'm going to go for a slightly more interesting one. Let's see if we can find one in the list there. Let's go for something like, I think there's a sphere in here. There we go, MSO pattern sphere. Feel free to try out some different ones if you like. But anyway, having done that, if I were now to change, well, let me just run up to that point with the breakpoint. If I hit the F5 key to run up to that point, and then if I hit F8 at that point, you'll hopefully see that you've already got the pattern applied with the back colour set to white. So the fore colour is that original blue colour. So if I hit F8 again now, that should change the little circle shapes in there, little spheres, to green. And then if I change the back colour, that will change the white background colour to pink. You can just about make that out. I should have picked a different pattern, shouldn't I, to make it a little more obvious. Anyway, you ought to be able to see this, and you can test obviously many different patterns using the list. Let's see what else we've got, just something very quick and simple. Let's go for a large grid. That should be a more obvious change. If I run that one again, there we go. So you can clearly see the pink colour in the background, and hopefully you make out the crosshatch shading there. The grid colour is in that lime green. Okay, now another way to display more than one colour on the same shape is to apply a fill gradient rather than a fill pattern. So to demonstrate how those work, let's make a copy of our change back colour subroutine, and let's paste that one in. And I'll change the name of this one so that it says, I've just realised that I've completely misspelled change back colour. I call it Chang back colour, never mind. So change back colour, let me spell that one properly at this point, apologies for that. Let's change the name of this new subroutine. We'll call this one to something like use one colour gradient, giving you a clue that we might do more than one colour shortly. So we'll stick with the same basic setup. We'll delete the existing shapes and create a brand new one, and then we'll use a width block again. I'm just going to get rid of the back colour. You don't technically set the back colour for a one colour gradient. I'm also going to get rid of the patterned fill effect, and I'll change it so that we've got a basic fore colour. Let's go with something a little more subtle than lime green this time. Let's go with something like RGB blue violet, let's say, sort of mid-purplish sort of colour. Okay, so having done that, what I can now do is apply to the fill property. I can apply a one colour gradient method. So I can do that by saying dot one colour gradient, and then type in a space, and you'll see there's a bunch of different parameters to fill in. So there are 3 parameters. First of all, the style of gradient. Let's go with MSO gradient diagonal down, let's say. Let's go with the first one, I guess. Feel free to experiment with these various options. They're all reasonably well described. So that's the style. Then the variant. Now, different gradient effects have up to 4 different variants, and you simply set one of those by putting in a number between 1 and 4. So for a diagonal down, that could be going from the top left or the top right. So I believe for this one there's just 2 variants. So I can choose either 1 or 2 for this one. Let's go with gradient number 1. If I then type in another comma, I can then enter the degree. Now the degree here is a little like the tint and shade and brightness properties. The range of values you're allowed to enter here for the degree is between 0 and 1. So 0 would fade my RGB blue violet colour towards black, and 1 would fade RGB blue violet towards white. So let's enter a value. I'm going to go for a value of 1, so it fades blue violet towards white. And then having done that, if I were simply to run that subroutine, there's not much point stepping through it. We're applying all the properties in one go. If I hit the run button, I'll end up with a new blue violet faded towards white with a diagonal fill one colour gradient. Beautiful. Okay, so setting a one colour gradient is fairly straightforward, and as it turns out, so is setting a two colour gradient. There's an inventively titled two colour gradient method. So switching back to the VB editor, let's just make a quick copy of our use one colour gradient subroutine, and then we can paste that in just down below. And I guess we better change the name of the subroutine. Let's call it use two colour gradient, just to be as inventive as Microsoft have been. And then we'll replace the one colour gradient method here with a new line in the with block that says dot two colour gradient. Now it's a slightly simpler method to use. You don't have to fill in an intensity. You just need to choose a style and then choose a variant for the style. So let's go with, I'm going to go with a horizontal gradient this time, and then I'm going to set the variant. Let's go with number 2. Next thing we need to do is set a back colour. So the two colours are both the fore colour and the back colour, and it is important which order you do this in, by the way. I'm making sure to set the back colour after I've set the gradient. So backColor.RGB equals, and let's go with RGB lime green. It was so beautiful and successful last time, so let's go with that. So having done that, if I were to run that subroutine, I'll end up with a purple to green fill effect. It's not that hideous, I suppose. I've certainly seen what I've created worse, trust me. Just to demonstrate that it is important to set the back colour after you've set the gradient, I'm going to cut that back colour line and place it above the gradient line, and then run that subroutine again, starting with a brand new shape, and you'll see that the back colour is masked at this point. So although I've set the back colour, the gradient overrides it. So do be slightly careful with this. Make sure, if I just undo that cut and paste, make sure that you do set the back colour after you've set the gradient. If I run that one again, we'll end up with what we expected. Now, it is possible to use far more than just 2 colours in a colour gradient, but sadly there aren't any more inventively named methods like 3 colour gradient, etc. The way you apply multiple colours to a colour gradient is by applying something called a gradient stop. So to begin with, what I'll do is switch back to the VB editor, and then let's make a copy of the use 1 colour gradient subroutine. It's important to start with a shape that already has at least 1 colour in a gradient, so I'm going to start with the use 1 colour gradient. Let's just modify the name so it says something like use multiple gradients, and then I want to essentially start the shape so that it's got a base background colour of white. So to do that, I'm going to set the fore colour to be RGB white. Let's go for RGB white, and then I'm going to use a vertical gradient this time, so rather than gradient diagonal down, I'm going to change that so it's MSO gradient vertical. And I'm going to use variant number 1, and then I'm going to use the value 1 as well. So essentially I'm going to fade white into white. The end result of this routine at this point, if I were to run the subroutine, is I just end up with a white coloured shape. But it's important to have set a gradient so that I can now add in something called a gradient stop. So inside my with block, what I'm going to do now is refer to the gradient stops collection. So I'm going to give myself a blank line there. So I'm going to say .gradient stops. And then I'm going to say dot insert. So that will allow me to create a brand new gradient stop. There's a couple of properties to fill in, or a couple of parameters to fill in for this. The first is the RGB value, so what colour I want to use for the gradient stop. So that's going to be an RGB colour, either as a number or as an RGB constant, or using the RGB function. Then the position of the stop, which is entered as a percentage, is entered as a decimal value that represents a percentage of the way along the shape. So what I would like to be able to do for my first example is I would like to insert a colour, a gradient stop of red that sits 1/4 of the way along this shape. So at 0.25 for the position with an RGB value of RGB red. So let's go for RGB red, and then the position of that will be 0.25. So just with that having been done, can I just run this subroutine to demonstrate what that one will do? So you'll see at that point it fades from white to absolute red, the specific RGB red value there, and then it fades back out again towards the end of the shape to whatever colour it was left with. So that makes sense, hopefully. So you can add as many of those gradient stops as you like. So the next one I want to do is about halfway along the shape. I'd like to see the colour graded towards green. So let's switch back to the VB editor, and I can just say dot gradient stops again. So I'm going to say dot gradient stops, dot insert, and I'm going to set this one to be RGB green, followed by a position of 0.5. And then let's just go the whole hog. Let's do blue as well. So dot gradient stops, dot insert, and then the next one will be RGB blue. The 3 colours, RGB of course, that's why I'm doing this, and then say 0.75. Okay, so having done that, if I were to just run that entire subroutine at this point, I'll end up with a fairly hideous looking shape, to be brutally fair, but hopefully that demonstrates the principle of how you can insert various gradient stops. You can see all these replicated on if you selected this shape and head to the Format tab and then look for the Shape Fill option. You might even want to just choose from the little dialog box button at the bottom right hand corner there to have a look at your fill colours, and you can hopefully see the 3 gradient stops that I've added represented in this little dialog here on the right hand side. Okay, that's probably more than you ever wanted to know about fill colours for shapes. Hopefully you found some of those techniques useful. There are quite a few other formatting options, of course, that we could apply, so let's just move on a little bit and look at some things like shape lines and some other of the interesting shape effects. So we'll do shape outlines next, I guess. Let's head back to the VB editor, and I guess we'll just create a copy of one of our simpler routines. Let me just go back up to the use 1 colour gradient subroutine, and if I simply copy that entire routine and paste it in down at the bottom, we'll change its name so it's called something like line formatting, I guess, and then have a quick look at some of the basic things that we can do. So let me just get rid of the statements inside the with block. I won't get rid of the with block entirely, because what I'm going to do here is refer to the line property of my shape. So I can say with s dot line. Now inside the with block there's a variety of different things I can do. just like with the fill colours, I can change the line forecolor and back colour. So if I say dot forecolor, that will allow me to change the main line colour. Back colour, just like for a fill colour, allows you to set patterned lines with different colours for the back colour. But I'm going to go with forecolor for now. So I'm going to say dot forecolor equals, and I don't know, let's go with RGB red. Let's make it nice and obvious. Of course, I've got to choose what type of colour I'm applying as well. So just like with the forecolors and back colours, I can choose either RGB or object theme colour or scheme colour. But I think we've established by now that RGB is probably the most sensible one to go for, or at least in this video it's the most sensible one to go for. So I'll go with .RGB equals RGB red. There's a couple of other basic things I can do as well, so I can apply a dash style to the line. I guess the sensible thing to do with the formatting properties with lines is to have a quick check through the names of the properties. They're all relatively straightforwardly named, and you can probably tell what most of these do just by the names of the properties. So let's just change a couple of extra ones. Let's go for dash style, which we'll set to be something like, let's go for some kind of dotted line. Let's go with MSO line dash. Actually, let's just go with the top option there. Make it nice and quick and simple. And then we can also change the weight of the lines. Let's say dot weight equals, and this is done as a value in points again, I believe. So let's set the weight to 2.5 points. Okay, so having done that, we'll run the subroutine and we'll end up with a shape with a red dotted 2.5 point thickness line. An alternative way to outline a shape is to use a glow effect. Now you can use those either in conjunction with a line or instead of a line. So let's just change the subroutine. In fact, let's make a copy of this subroutine so we can demonstrate the basics of a glow effect, or at least the code behind it. Let's call it glow formatting. And what I'll do in this case is I'm going to set the line to be invisible. So I'm going to write a separate line here that will say s.line.visible equals MSO false. That will turn the outline off. And then rather than using the width block to format the line, I'm going to use the width block to format the glow effect of the shape. So I can say with s.glow. Now again, there's a variety of different things I can do with the glow effect. Let's change the colour first of all, and as ever I can set the colour to be via RGB colours or object theme colours or scheme colours. Again, I'm going to use RGB colours. Let's go with making it equal to RGB hot pink. And then I can set the transparency of the glow effect. So let's say dot transparency equals, now this is done as a percentage, so if I set it to be 0.25, that's sort of 25% transparent. And then I can set the radius, so how far out from the edge of the shape the glow effect glows, I suppose, if you like. So let's set the radius to be equal to, let's go for 15. Now this is in points again, so it'll be 15 points glowing around this blue rectangle shape. So having done all that, if I were to simply run the subroutine, there's my lovely pink glow effect. Another simple effect you can apply to the border of the shape is something called a soft edge. So to demonstrate that, let's again make a quick copy of my glow formatting routine, and then I can change that so that it's called edge formatting. Something quick and simple. And I'll turn the line off again, so I'll make the line invisible. But this time, rather than setting all these properties for the glow in the width block, I'm going to change that. So it's s.softEdge. And inside there's a couple of simple properties I can change. Let's go with the type first of all. So I can say softEdge.type equals, and this is just a case of choosing one from the list. So let's go with the first one in the list, I suppose. And we can always change that if we don't like the effect afterwards. And then we just need to choose a radius. So sort of how far in points does the soft edge effect affect the shape. So I can set the radius to be equal to, let's go with 6 points this time. Let's see what effect that has. So you won't see the pink glow effect this time, but we should see the edges of the shape soften, so it sort of fades into view rather than that harsh boundary between that and the worksheet. Let's run the subroutine, and there you go, there's a soft edge effect for our basic rectangle shape. Yet another effect you can apply is a reflection effect. So let's just copy the previous subroutine one more time and paste it in down below. Give myself a bit more space. Let's change the name of the subroutine so that it's called reflection formatting. And then once again we'll take away the code from the middle of the width block and also the dot soft edge part from the width line. Instead I'll say with s.reflection this time. Now there's a few different properties to fill in. First of all, there's a transparency effect, kind of just like with the glow effect from earlier on. I'm going to set the transparency to be 0.25, so it's a percentage value again. We can also set the size of the effect. This is done in a value of points, so the size I'm going to make it equal to 75. Then I'm going to set the offset effect using points as well. So the offset is the distance from the actual shape itself that the reflection begins. I'll set that to be quite small. I'll set the offset to about 3. Then I can also apply a blur effect. So let's set a blur of 10. So this is done to sort of make the reflection less sort of sharp, I guess. Well, obviously it's blurring it, of course it's going to make it less sharp. So if you wanted to modify any of these values just to see their effects, please do feel free. Otherwise I'm just going to run this subroutine and we'll see a slightly blurred reflection sitting just below the shape with about a 3-point gap between the shape and the start of the reflection itself. One last simple type of effect you can apply to a shape is a shadow effect. So once again, let's just copy the previous routine and paste it down below. And then change the name of the subroutine, so we'll call this one shadow formatting. And then let's take the code out of the with block and change dot reflection to dot shadow. Now there's quite a few different properties to change with a shadow. So first of all, let's choose a particular shadow style. So I'm going to say dot style equals, and then go for an outer shadow. And then I'm going to choose a type of shadow. So I'm going to say dot type equals, and this is just choosing from a list of preset shadow types. So I'm going to go with one inventively called number 25, just because I've tested this one previously. That's the one that I want. Feel free to test this to your heart's content. Choose as many different shadow types as you like until you get the one that you actually want. And then there's a blur effect we can apply. So I'm going to set a blur of 5, just like with the reflection effect we've just looked at. Then there's also an offset effect, just again like the reflection effect. Now with a reflection you can only offset in one direction, but with a shadow you can offset in both the X and the Y direction. So there are two separate properties for that. There's an offset X, let's set that to be something like 8, and then I'm going to do an offset Y and set that to be equal to 8 as well. And then a couple more to go. Let's set a transparency effect, again just like with the reflection, so I can say transparency equals 0.25. And then last of all I can choose a colour for the shadow. So I can do that using the for colour property, so I can say dot for colour, dot, and then once again I can choose either RGB or theme colour or scheme colour, but let's go with RGB. And I'd like my shadow to be basically like a pale grey colour, effectively, kind of like a shadow colour. Now ways to generate grey colours using RGB values, the simplest way to do that I think is to use the RGB function and then set every value of RGB to be exactly the same number. So if I set them to be 0, 0, 0, that would end up as completely black. If I set them to be 255, 255, 255, that would be completely white. And any value in between those, as long as they're all the same, will generate a shade of grey. So yes, the author lied to you. I use author in the loosest possible sense of the word. What's her name? E.L. James. Yeah, there aren't just 50 shades of grey. There are slightly more than that, according to VBA at least. So let's go with a sort of a middling grey colour. I'm going to go with 150, 150, 150. And there we go. Okay, so having done all of that, I won't bother stepping through this one. You can easily do that at your own leisure. I'm just going to run this entire subroutine, and that will end up with my slightly offset, slightly blurred, middling grey shadow effect. Okay, so there is one final set of formatting options I'd like to very quickly look at. It's difficult to look at them quickly because there are simply so many settings to apply. These are the 3D effects you can apply to shapes in sort of modern versions of Office. So just to manually show you how this works in the first place, if I switch back into the VB editor, back into Excel and select my shape and then head to the Format tab in the ribbon, looking at the Shape Effects button here and halfway along the Format tab, obviously we looked at the basics of shadow effects, reflections, glow effects, soft edges, but we've also got these bevel effects which provide a 3D element to the shape and also 3D rotation. Now there are an astonishing number of options and properties you can set with these 3D effects. If you have a quick look, if you choose the 3D options menu from the list there, you'll see a whole great big long list of different properties, and there's just a bewildering list of these. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but just to show you the basics of how you can apply these 3D bevel effects and 3D rotation effects. At least you've seen the basics of the code. What we're going to do is write a simple little subroutine just as we did earlier on, copy pasting what we've done previously. So switching back to the VB editor, let's copy our shadow formatting routine. I'm going to copy that and then just paste it in quickly and just modify the name so that it's called 3D formatting. Now, knowing that you can't begin a subroutine with a number, you will spell it as 3D formatting with the actual literal spelling of the word. And then let's just take away all of the code from inside the with block, and let's change the with block so that it says with s.3d. Okay, so I'm just going to apply a bunch of different properties here and then step through the code so you can see the effect of each one. Let's start with a depth property. So I'm going to say .depth equals, and then I'm going to set that to be equal to a value of 1. Then I'm going to set a contour width property. So I'm going to say .contour width equals 1 as well. And then I'm going to set a preset material. So I'm going to say preset material, get there eventually, .preset material equals, and I'm going to choose a MSO material matte 2, as it turns out. I'm using ones that I've previously used, which I know generate some kind of interesting looking effect, so you can see something going on. And then I'm also going to set a preset lighting value as well, so .preset lighting, and preset lighting equals, and I'm going to go with a light rig bright room, so that's the second option in the list. Okay, a little bit of rotation as well, so let's say increment rotation. I'm going to go with the x-axis first of all. I'm going to do that by 25 points, and then I'm going to set an increment rotation y, so increment rotation y, and I'm going to set that -5, and then increment rotation z. So you've got 3 different axes, as you'd expect with a 3-dimensional shape. Increment rotation z, let's set that, let's increment it by 5. A couple of extra things to do with the bevel, which describes sort of the border of this 3D shape. Let's set the bevel top type first of all to be equal to MSO bevel circle, and then I'm going to set the bevel top inset, pretending that I know exactly what all of these things do. I just know that they generate some kind of basic effect to demonstrate. Then bevel top depth, I'll set that to be 10 as well. And then the bevel bottom type, nearly there. Bevel bottom type, I'm going to set that to be, equal to an MSO bevel circle again. Likewise, as with all the other properties, do feel free to play around with these to generate some other effects. Recording macros to demonstrate the 3D effects is a pretty useful technique as well, just so you can see exactly what's been changed when you've changed properties manually. So I'll go with bottom inset equals 10, and then finally bevel top inset equals, bottom depth, bevel bottom depth equals 10 as well. Okay, so without explaining in too much detail, as I say, there are lots of different ways to get exactly the properties you want, and I think we could probably fill an entire video's worth of individual 3D effect properties. Maybe that's worthwhile doing in the future. But for now, all I'm going to do is set a quick breakpoint on the depth line and then hit F5 to run up to that point, so you can see clearly there is no 3D effect at this point. If I hit F8 to begin stepping through, you'll see that these effects gradually begin to be applied and the rotation occurs. It's not until we really get to the bevel properties that things really start to become 3-dimensional, but all the other properties are important to get this effect where you've got the highlighting and the depth effect. You can see there hopefully just about, and as I carry on going you'll see that all these properties are being applied, and then eventually we've ended up with some kind of 3-dimensional-ish looking shape. It's not the most impressive thing in the world, I admit. I haven't spent a huge amount of time doing it, but you'll hopefully be able to see again on the format shape panel on the right hand side of the screen, if you have that displayed, that all the properties you've set in code here have also appeared and have been changed in the dialog box in the panel on the right. So hopefully that's given you at least a bit of a preview of the sorts of things you can do. I'm sure you can generate much more exciting and interesting things than I just have done there with that simple demonstration, but there's a nice little starting point for you. Okay, so we're nearly there for this video. We've looked at quite a variety of different formatting techniques so far. What I'd like to do just for the very last part is look at a couple of techniques you can use to quickly apply formats to shapes. So first of all, I want to look at how you can copy formatting effects from one shape to another. So to demonstrate how that works, I'm going to switch back to the VB editor, and then I'm going to scroll back up to the subroutine in which we created a 2-color gradient, and I'm going to copy that entire routine, and then I'm just going to switch, in fact I'm going to create a new module. Let's insert a new module and then paste that code in, and then let's just change the name of this one so that it says apply multiple formatting, or apply many formatting options. I changed my mind to be lazy. Apply many formatting options. Then I'm going to switch back to module 1 by double clicking on it, and then I'm just going to take some line formatting and then go back to module 2 and paste that with block in, and then back to module 1 again and scroll down to the glow formatting and take the width block from there. You probably get the idea by this point. And give myself a couple of blank lines, and then back to module 1 and the edge formatting, and then 2 more to go. If I just paste that one in, I've got the reflection and the shadow still to go, so let's just copy that reflection code and back to module 2 and paste that in, and then finally back to module 1 one last time and copy the shadow effect stuff as well. Okay, so you'll agree that's a reasonably large amount of formatting options all being applied to a single shape. If I were to run that single subroutine, I'll end up with a fairly hideous, horrific looking shape there. But just imagine that that wasn't as horrific as it currently looks. And let's say you wanted to copy those formatting options to a new shape that you've just created. Here's how you can go about doing it. So let's create a new subroutine just below the one we've pasted together. I'll give myself a bit more room and create a new subroutine called copy formatting. And then I'm going to declare 2 variables just to make my life slightly easier. I'm going to say dim s1 as shape, and then also dim s2 as shape. So nothing particularly inventive. I'm going to set s1 to be equal to sheet1.shapes1. So that references the existing shape on the sheet. Then I'm going to set s2 to be equal to sheet1.shapes.addShape, and I'm going to create an MSO rectangle. It doesn't have to be a rectangle, MSO shape rectangle, beg your pardon. It doesn't have to be a rectangle, but it seemed like the most obvious choice as we've been using rectangles so far. The left I'm going to set to be 20, the top I'm going to set to be, let's say, about 250, and then I'm going to set the width to 200 and the height to 100. Okay, now having done that, I'd like my new shape to take on exactly the same formatting properties as the previous one. So to do that, I can say s1.pickup. So it's almost like using the Format Painter button. If you're familiar with the Format Painter, you can click on a shape and then click Format Painter to pick up all the formats, then click onto another shape to apply them. So s1.pickup and then s2.apply. It's as simple as that. Really, really straightforward. So just to step through, I'll set a breakpoint and then hit the F5 key up to that point, so I've got my new basic boring blue shape. If I use F8 to pick up the formats and then F8 again to apply them, I've got another equally beautiful pink glowing purple and green reflected shape. I do apologise for the hideous appearance of that shape. I hadn't realised how horrible it was going to look. Anyway, hopefully that's enough to give you the idea about copying formatting. Now imagine if you can, and I appreciate that it's quite difficult with the appearance of this particular shape, but imagine if you wanted every new shape that you drew in this workbook to have exactly the same formatting options as one of these two. So to make that work, I'm just going to manually delete one of those 2 shapes, and then what I'm going to do next is write a new subroutine that sets the default shape formats. In fact, what might be easier to do is just copy and paste the existing one, and I can paste that in, and I'm going to change this one so it says setting default formats, something along those lines. Okay, so the important thing here is that I've set a reference to shape 1 first of all, which is the only shape that currently exists on that sheet. Now that I've got a reference to it, what I can do is say s1 dot set shape default properties, and it's as simple as that. What that means is now any new shape that I draw will have the exact same formatting properties as the one that I've just created here. So let's just prove that by changing the shape type for the one we'll create. Let's draw something like, I don't know, an MSO shape smiley face, or anything else more interesting than that. And we don't need to apply any formatting options to this new shape at all. If I just run the subroutine, we're not copy pasting things. I'm so sorry. We're not copy pasting or picking up and applying formats. Any new shape that we draw now from this point on will have those exact same formatting properties. That's even true on a new worksheet. If I were to create a brand new blank worksheet called Sheet 2 and then switch back to the VB editor, let's just really quickly make a quick copy paste of this subroutine, and then let's just take away the code that sets a reference to shape 1 entirely, and that variable, and let's just modify the name of the routine. Let's call it using default formats, and then of course make sure that I'm adding this to sheet 2 rather than sheet 1. And if I were to run that one now, we'll see that this shape yet again has those fixed formats. So yeah, every new shape that I draw now in this workbook will have those exact same shape default formats. Okay, the very last thing just to quickly cover in this video, if you didn't want to bother creating your own particular shape default formats or your own particular shape styles, you can always use some of the preset shape styles instead. So if I selected my fairly hideous deformed shape and head to the Format tab in the ribbon, there's a whole bunch of built-in shape styles you can apply using the Shape Styles menu. So these sort of correspond or take their colours at least from the theme colour you've applied. So if I wanted a slightly more sober-looking smiley face than the one I've just created, then yeah, something like applying a shape style will be a sensible choice. You can apply shape styles really easily just using a very simple method. So if I just quickly delete that shape from sheet 2 manually, switch back to the VB editor, and I'm just going to use the same subroutine I've just written here. I'm going to say s2 dot shape style equals, and then simply select one from the list. I'm just going to pick one at random, number 13 as it turns out, and if I use the F8 key to step through, I'll find that first of all my shape appears with its fairly hideous formatting, and if I hit F8 again, it will apply a slightly more sober looking shape style. So yeah, you've got all the built-in shape styles there as well. Okay, so I think that's probably enough for this basic video on formatting shapes. We've got a few more things to talk about the shapes. Primarily, we've got text to deal with. We haven't added any text to any of our shapes yet, and that's a slightly different topic, so we'll have a separate video all for text. Hope you found this one useful and your eyes don't hurt after some of the formats we've applied there. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseOwl website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.